Hello, my name is Rich Howard, owner of Architectural Builders Supply. In this video is to bring you a closer look at the Stanley number 2060R. This is a 3.5 inch by 3.5 inch single acting full mortise spring hinge. We have one removed here. It's got a small amount of tension on the hinge, as you can see. And I'm going to relieve that so we can make a little better video by not having spring tension set. And I'm going to go over the procedure by which spring tension is manipulated, set, removed. So we'll go over all of that. So I've got that relaxed. Now this is a spring hinge. It is Stanley's line of their single acting spring hinges, which is the 2060R. Available in, of course, different finishes. This happens to be the what would be called US 3, more accurately called 632 finish. This is made of steel. US 3 doesn't tell us the base material, but it means polished brass. 632 by BHMA tells us it's not only made of steel, but that it is polished brass plated with a lacquer applied over it. Okay. This is a 3.5, 3.5. That means that the height of the hinge is 3.5 tall, and the width is 3.5. The height is the first dimension. That's important to know because not all hinges are square like this. There are 4.5 by 4. There are 5 by 8. So it's simply important to know that the first dimension is the height of your hinge. Okay. You could easily have 4.5 by 4 spring hinges. It's important to know the height is the 4.5 component of that part number so that you can prep your doors and frames accordingly. Very infrequently someone is thinking a 4.5 by 4 is a 4-inch hinge. It's the height. That's the most important dimension. There are, and Stanley's method of setting their tension is unique to them, which we'll go over. There is information down below in this video in the extended description. Let me first tell you the different finishes that are available on this hinge, and I'm going to pull it up here on another screen. US 10 for satin bronze, US 10A for oxidized satin bronze, 26 for polished chrome, 26D for satin chrome, US 3 for polished brass, 32 for polished stainless, 32D for satin stainless, 4 for satin brass, and then P for prime coat. So you can do this hinge in lots of different finishes. Now the information down below this video, ideal for use in corridors, entrances, and stairways. Before we get to this, this is a 3.5, 3.5. Where's this hinge going to be used? On 1 3/8 thick doors. 3.5 by 3.5 is not the proper size for an 1 3/4 thick door. You can use it. It will fit. You can make it work. But a 4-inch or a 4.5 inch would be the proper hinge height for a 1 3/4 thick door. So everything we're about to talk about, much of it won't apply because you're probably installing this on an 1 3/8 door. And what I mean is that stamping that's there, the UL label that's there, and then the attesting of the listed on the back probably doesn't apply, meaning you're probably not installing this on a fire rated door. Ideal for use in corridors, entrances, and stairwells. You're probably installing this in your home where you have an 1 3/8 door and you just want it to close behind you, whatever that might be. Automatically closes doors, an alternative to overhead mounted door closers. They are indeed. I'm not a fan of spring hinges when it comes to reliably closing doors because they don't have a lot of stored energy when the door is getting to the very crucial last 10 to 15 degree of close. You know, that most of that stored energy in the spring, as the hinge leaf opens, it stores energy, and as it closes, it's released. So at the end of that, there's not a lot of energy left on the hinge itself. Okay, and that translates to, with a hydraulic overhead closer, overhead surface, overhead concealed, floor closer, you've got that amount of pressure that is bringing the door closed through the entire closing cycle, whether it be 90 to 0 or 180 to 0. The amount from 10 to 15 is the same as 65 to 75. You see my point? You're going to bring that closed all the way. With a spring hinge, that arc of stored tension just drops when it gets to the very end. So it may not be ideal. You might not have enough stored energy in the spring itself to get the door to actually overcome all the air resistance, the latch bolt and its friction to get it to properly latch. That could be a major problem if you have a fire-rated door. Again, in this instance, you probably don't. So let's continue with the extended description of the item. So this hinge does meet NFPA requirements for 3-hour fire-rated doors. If you were installing a hinge onto a fire-rated door, that would be important to note that the hinge would be both a listed product, means that it has been tested and is found to be in compliance with the requirements of the fire test, and that listing, that paperwork, reports, conclusions, findings, would be on file at the testing laboratory. A spring hinge must be labeled as well. So you can have a product that's listed, like a ball bearing steel-based hinge, 4.5, 4.5. That is a listed product. It's approved for use on fire-rated doors, providing it's listed, which I'm sure that they all are. Every manufacturer probably has their product tested. But it doesn't have to be labeled. However, with a spring hinge, that is not the case. The spring hinge absolutely needs to be labeled. It needs to have visual evidence of the fact that it is in compliance. If you are closing a fire-rated door with a spring hinge, do not install one that does not have a visual indicator that it is a listed product. They exist where they do not, so be careful and stay away from those hinges that are not listed, therefore, but labeled. Okay, they have to be labeled. I've had people call and say, where are my hinges? Well, okay, they're shipping. Here's the tracking number, or shipping next week, that kind of thing. Get into the conversation. Hey, what are you using it for? Oh, I've got this door that the mudroom door, and the inspector's coming, so I can get final occupancy on the home. And it turns out it's some bootleg hinge that doesn't have any certification. So luckily, we were able to mitigate the problem and get the client a product that was listed. The reason that it's important to have it listed is not that it has the stamp on it, which is mandatory, but the fact that it's been put into a fire test scenario and has been found to be compliant. It passed the test, a 3-hour fire test. The temperature is going to get to 1800 degrees in 120 seconds, and then it's going to stay there for the next 2 hours and 57 minutes. So, the hinge has to be tested. Moving down through the extended description information, lifetime warranty for the life of the building. Stanley is very proud of their hinges, and they should be. They're a very high-quality product, at least in my opinion. Internal ratchet mechanism eliminates loose adjustment pins. This design is unique, where they don't have any tension pins. All you need is a easily obtainable Allen wrench. Since we're talking about it, let's take the size of what that Allen wrench is. .155. 0.155. 3/30? No, 5/32. 0.155. 1 divided by 32 times 5. Yeah, so 5/32 of an inch is that Allen wrench size. Now moving forward, this is a full mortise hinge. You can see from the swag on the hinge leaves here that when the leaves are brought parallel, and that ratcheting on that spring is okay, when they're brought parallel, they're meant to be mortised flush to the edge of the door and frame, so you have that margin between the door leaf and between the edge of the door and the jamb and the rabbet of the frame itself. So this is called a full mortise hinge, and that's why it is so, because of that situation. This leaf thickness is probably about 123 thousandths. Let's take a look. Oh, no, forgive me. It's this is a residential hinge. This hinge is about .098. They have it at .099. .099. Yeah, .098. So there you go. That is how thick the hinge is. That would be considered a residential leaf. A commercial leaf in this size would be about 123 thousandths. Furthering the fact that 1 3/8, 3.5 inch, .099. That all goes together normally. Square corners. You can have spring hinges that have radiused corners, but square corner is very common, and the standard for 2060Rs, although they can do radius in some of them. Made of steel, we demonstrate that. Polished brass finish and sold as each, and screws are included as well. You'll get all machine screws and all wood screws, so you have no trouble with that. These screws have a little fly cut feature to the tip of them where they're meant to clear the wood out as they come in. Obviously, pre-drill the holes. Just don't run those in. You don't want to split the style. There is no elegant way to repair a split style because you didn't pre-drill the holes. Now, let's move on to the links down below this video. Okay, now as we're moving on, I'm going to start looking at the documents that we have. Let's just start at the top, product catalog. That is going to be a really great overview in terms of performing the function of being a cut sheet, like letting you know what the Stanley Hinge is all about. So in particular, when we get to the second page, you're going to see how the part number changes as the hinge changes. The 2060R is going to be a steel-based hinge that will be available in a variety of finishes. This version here and this version here are a stainless steel base material and a polished stainless and a satin stainless. Okay. The next three hinges are the same concept except steel-based hinge, stainless and polished, stainless and satin, but with a 1/4 inch radius. The third concept is the same, except with a 5/8 radius. Okay, so that's important to know that these hinges are available in many finishes and in different base materials and different corner treatments. Square, 1/4 inch radius, 5/8 radius. All of the information that's here down below, okay, is what we've just already talked about. With the exception of, there are some decorative tips that are available, and they can even do electric switch options as well in a 4.5 inch size, obviously. They do have the ability to do a special screw hole pattern, but that will need to be reviewed with the factory, and we'll get to the template when we talk about these screw hole locations. The installation instructions here we'll get to in a follow-up email, a follow-up document. This is an overview of the item itself, what it looks like to order this material. Application guidelines, which we'll go over separately, are here as well for your 4.5, your 4 inch, and then your 3.5 inch. So really down in here is the hinge that we're dealing with, the 3.5 inch size. The final page would be a really good cut sheet as well. It is the reference to this is where you can order a set of them, which is very common, where you would have a set of a FBB 179, a standard ball bearing hinge, where you're going to mix and match it with a spring hinge. So in a typical set, in a 4.5 by 4.5 in polished brass, prime coat, or satin chrome, would give you 2 springs and a regular ball bearing hinge. And you would always, without exception, install the ball bearing hinge at the top location, and your spring hinges will be in your middle and bottom locations. Spring hinges everywhere except the top is where you want that. Okay, is where that's going to go. If you have an 8-foot tall door, that would for sure be a non-fire rated door. By the way, spring hinges are not listed, not approved for use on doors that exceed 7 foot in height, and you will see that the guidelines only go up to 7 foot height. Here, however, they show it for doors up to 180 pounds. They should have there for non-fire rated openings. You would not have a fire rated compliant opening using spring hinges for a door that exceeds 3070. So these are your application guidelines, and that works if it's non-fire rated. If it's fire rated, you're going to stop at 7 foot height and 3 foot in width. Okay. If you had 8-foot tall doors and you had, 4 hinges, obviously, you'll put your spring hinges in the bottom 2, 3, and 4 if you have 3 spring hinges. You might, but 2 would be pretty typical for that application. So that is the document that's called Product Catalog. Full Mortise template spring hinges. Let's take a look at that. That is going to give you an idea of what our hinge looks like dimensionally. We're dealing with a 3.5 inch size, and those dimensions are going to be based on, we're dealing with a 3.5 inch unit. This is a 3.5 inch template. Okay. all of the dimensional properties that all of the ones that we've covered, and then some additional ones. Locations of the holes for the screws in particular. So that's a nice way to be able to verify beforehand of what you have. You can obviously do a square corner, 5/8 radius, 5/8 radius here, that inner line, or a 1/4 inch radius. The overall height is 4 inch on that barrel. When you get to a 4x4 or a 4.5, 4.5, that hinge leaf goes straight across the top of the barrel. You know, shows you what dimension A is, the outside diameter of the barrel, should you need to know that. You know, a 3.5 inch hinge from this leaf to that center line is going to be 1 3/4 inches. So not too much else there to look at. Let's move to the next document called cut page, and that will be a lot of what we've already gone over. Now, as we move on into the cut sheet, or the cut page, cut sheet, this will be a very appropriate, adequate document for your use when forwarding to someone else that you wish to express exactly what you're supplying. And a lot of information is on this single condensed page. It's really just for the use in transmitting your intent on the hinge. Application guidelines, let's dive into that, and we've already really touched on it. The installation instructions are included with the paperwork, and the back side of the card is the installation instructions is about the size of a Rolodex card. If you are familiar with the term Rolodex, you are not a millennial. Just kidding. The installation instructions are on a Rolodex size card, and the back side is the application guideline. Stanley has engineered these hinges to be appropriate with this and follow these guidelines for proper, safe and healthy operating doors. Okay. NFPA 80 stipulates minimum 2 spring hinges shall be used. They should also place there a maximum door size of 3070. NFPA is the National Fire Protection Agency. 80 is the standard that they're referring to. There are dozens of standards. NFPA 101 happens to be the life safety standard. When the local building code adopts a portion of NFPA 80 into the code, that portion of NFPA 80 becomes a part of the code. So it's out of NFPA 80 where you're going to find these references to spring hinges. And in fact, we can even go a step further and show you that passage to NFPA 80. Forgive me, I'm finding the one that is searchable. And as you get into the document, and you know, NFPA 80 is a document that's purchased. You own it. You are just free to share it. So this is my copy of the device. And as we get into NFPA 80 and the different chapters and the occupancies that it applies to, you're going to find references to spring hinges. There's no doubt. And let's find that reference to the size. So first of all, in NFPA 80, for spring hinges, in 6.4.3.1.1.2, where spring hinges are used, at least 2 shall be provided. Okay, so that's where that falls into place. Here's another section where we talked about earlier. Spring hinges shall be labeled and shall meet the requirements. Okay, so your spring hinge automatically has to be labeled. In the Annex A of NFPA 80, under 6.4.1.4, it says spring hinges should be adjusted to achieve positive latching where allowed to close freely from a 30-degree open position. So when testing your spring hinges, you are obligated to get it to close and latch when it's 30 degrees open. Anything less than that, it wouldn't be, that's where you're going to be testing it at, is the bottom line. And it's in the table on 6.4.3.1 is where it gets into, and it's not expressly indicated, but in this table, builder's hardware, hinges, spring hinges, and pivots. Hinge type, steel mortise or surface, pommel or olive knuckle, steel pivots, steel mortise or surface, and we get down to here to self-closing, and then down to here to self-closing, and down to here to self-closing, okay? Maximum rating, so we're only dealing with self-closing. Maximum rating, 90-minute. Here, well, 3 hour or less. Maximum door size, 3 foot by 7 foot. Minimum hinge size, 4.5 inch. It is also permissible to use a minimum of a 4 inch size, meeting these requirements. Now, what you'll very interestingly note for an 1 3/8 door, 3 hour or less, which doesn't exist. Well, it does in a steel door. You could get a 1 3/8 fire rated steel door. The issue, though, is that in a self-closing hinge, here's our problem. So while this 3.5 inch hinge is permissible on fire rated doors, certainly, it is wholly impermissible because it does not meet the minimum criteria for leaf thickness. So this .099 hinge is, according to NFPA 80, which is a standard and not the code, is a non-fire rated product. So you can't use it there at all. So this is really the document. Now, keep in mind, NFPA 80 is a standard. Okay? It's only code if it's been adopted by your local building code. Otherwise, it's just simply a set of suggestions, so to speak. So let's move on to looking at instructions. Okay, now the installation instructions. This would be the front of that Rolodex card, so to speak. So basically there's that we guessed correctly, that 5/32 of an inch hex wrench, which is included. And what you want to do is to rotate it clockwise to increase the torque, and do not exceed 6 clicks. You had heard it click earlier. This is assuming that the tension collar is pointed towards the top of the door, and there would be no reason why you would install it upside down. You could, but there'd be no reason to do so. There is also, and I'll show it to you in a moment, the locking safety screw. There is one unusual screw in the screw pack that will close off the top of the Allen wrench access. Now, to decrease the torque, you insert the wrench and then you push it down and in so as to disengage. And let's just demonstrate that right now. Okay, so that screw that we talked about first is here. There's one unusual, unique screw that's there. That's going to go down into that hole, and there are threads down there that you will use to simply close that off. You don't want anything getting in there. No reason for any of that. Now, to increase torque, your tension collar is towards the top of the door. You're simply going to insert it and turn it clockwise. And you're going to hear those clicks. Okay, I'm closed now. 3, 4, 5, 6. If you're going to 90 degrees, I would go 6. If you're going past 90, I would probably back that off 1 or 2 ratchets. So right now, there'd be no way for me to peel that open. There's too much tension set on there. To decrease it, same wrench, but now I need to, once it's seated, I need to push it in. Okay. So the magic sauce on that was to push it in and then give it a very slight amount of clockwise rotation. Push it in, and then I felt the wrench seat further in, and then clockwise slightly, and then back it off. And you can continue to back it off in that fashion until you continue to relax the hinge. So to decrease it, it's really push it in and a slight amount of clockwise just to get it, because that spring is hooking into the mechanism. You need to be able to relieve that so that then the spring can come out, is kind of how it works. And that's how you do that. After you get it set, put that small screw in there and you're in good shape. Here's that Rolodex card we had mentioned earlier. Okay. Very simple and straightforward. It's a 5/32 wrench, you know, so it could be something that you have readily available, but at the same time, you might want to keep it handy. I find that spring hinges are, doors equipped with spring hinges are pieces of equipment that always require maintenance. Here's another thing that Stanley does before I go back to the setting of the spring hinges. These are shims. These are cardboard shims. It's very typical, very common to shim a door. You can tear these off. They're perforated. Loosen the screws on the hinge, insert them behind, tighten it down, the whole 9 yards. You'll be able to take that door and cant it, tip it forward, backwards, however you need to relieve the door to maybe help mitigate a margin that's not adequate. And that's a whole nother conversation in terms of margins in fire-rated doors. There's a lot of definition in NFPA 80 about maximum sizes permissible and what you can and most certainly cannot do to a fire-rated wood door. But cardboard shims are not permissible on fire-rated doors at all. So be sure to use only steel shims should you need to. Now the setting of spring hinges, I would keep that wrench on hand because what you'll find is the setting of the spring hinge is going to be different in the middle of summer than it is in the middle of winter. Air pressure is different. The pressure that the building is dealing with is different. You might want to be able to back that spring off a little bit because you've got, you know, more air movement through a building in the summer than you would in the winter when everything's buttoned up. You might need to increase that to contend with a backflow scenario. And then be mindful, ultimately at the end of the day, a spring hinge may not solve the problem for predictably and reliably closing a door, whether it be just the bathroom door in your home or an unused bedroom door that you would prefer to have it just simply closed because you don't want the cat going in there. This is a real thing, a reason why people buy spring hinges. So the bottom line is, they're great in lots of instances, but they're not the perfect solution in many others. So be mindful that it is an option to close doors, but not, of course, the only option. It's an option certainly with limitations. Finally, there is a link below this video to the manufacturer's page where you can pull up not only all of the Stanley products that we sell, but a link to the manufacturer's website, as well as a link to the full product catalog. I'm incredibly partial when it comes to Stanley. I like their products. What I like the most about their product is the fit and finish. It just is a handsome hinge when you get your hands on it. I've seen how hinges are manufactured, and I'm in awe as to how truly laborious and complicated of a process it is. And to make the hinge look so nice, to have such a exceptional fit and finish, when you hold it in your hand and you appreciate how nice of a piece of hardware it just simply looks like. Stanley does that very well, and I've always appreciated that from them. I believe they're in their product. Their name is synonymous and has been since the mid-19th century with hardware. That link below this video to the manufacturer's page will allow you to get to the product catalog, and if you're interested about the science of hinges, they do a great job. The first portion of that catalog will teach you half mortise, half surface, full mortise, full surface, what you use, when you use, what the dimensions are, and a great encyclopedic document. And if you deal in commercial builders hardware, I would recommend that you review it. Any questions on the Stanley number 2060R pardon me, 2060. This is a 2060R, indeed. It doesn't say it on the box, but it is. In a 3.5, 3.5, and a US 3 polished brass finish, or any other Stanley product, please feel free to reach out to us. And thank you